Hey, Dustin Hawkinsmith back from PennLive. Welcome to another edition of the new PennLive Wrestling Podcast. We're talking all about wrestling in this space moving forward. Our focus this week, as you may have seen, is on girls wrestling and that movement. It's part of our Girls Wrestling Week of content here. We welcome now in that capacity, Mr. Mark Byers. He's the Chief Operating Officer of the PIAA, also head of the PIAA's Wrestling Steering Committee. Mark's right at the heart of this conversation to try to move the sport of girls wrestling forward. Mark, thanks first and foremost for being here and sharing a little bit about your processes and where you're coming from on all this.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for having me, Dustin.
I did want to try to allow people to see your face. And, I'm going to kind of start with the big picture question that I'm sure you have heard a lot. Where is the PIAA when it comes to the process of moving girls wrestling forward? And I think a lot of people are asking the question, why is this taking so long?
Sure. I think I told you this before that we oftentimes have been likened to aircraft carriers where we can make turns, just takes an awful long time to do so. And part of that is simply a process that we're an association of member schools. So when a sport is added, I believe what the board is looking for is to be assured that the membership is supportive of that. There are other sports out there that are currently being supported at the local school level. And so although girls wrestling may be most prominent in the news, sports like rugby certainly are being currently hosted and participating. I know there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 schools on both the boys and girls side that have it. Again, that slow process has a lot to do with just making sure that our membership is supportive. And by support, they're sponsoring the sport of girls wrestling and providing for those opportunities.
One of the things that came up recently, I believe it was at your July board meeting, which you mentioned at that point, your board meetings are mercifully slowing down a little bit. You're able to, we'll see what happens in the months to come here because
be careful.
At a different crossroads. I don't want to, jinx anything, but the idea of emerging sport status came up in July. Can you explain what that is and why that's relevant, framed around the girls wrestling conversation, but just the broader idea of emerging sport status and how that can help?
Yeah, and like you said, some of the things have taken a long time. This was first a discussion by the board at their July 2019 meeting. And we tend to put things through a 3-reading protocol with the idea that as an opportunity to get the information out, individuals can read it, make suggestions to members of the board for potential changes. So this has been in the works. And then 2020 came along and COVID happened. And a lot of things, although we met certainly more often than we did previous years, a lot of things were placed on the back burner that weren't specific to getting our current sports off the ground. And emerging sports was one of them. But at this most recent July meeting, we represented that document with the idea that any sport, not just girls wrestling, but I said rugby, the NFL is hot to have girls flag football moving forward as a spring sport. So those schools in the southeast corner and western part of the state around the Eagles and Steelers are being asked to give that some consideration as well. But I think ultimately what this boils down to is we oftentimes get criticized that if we don't assume jurisdiction over a sport, our membership is not going to support it. They want to see that PIAA is sponsoring a sport before they, as a local school, are willing to sponsor the sport. Well, on the flip side, as an association, if our membership is not supportive of a sport, why should the board give consideration to sponsor it? So it comes down to the chicken and the egg. And I think the emerging sports process is an attempt for us to answer that question of the chicken and the egg, embrace sports that do have school sponsorship, and show to the rest of the membership that may have some consideration in starting those programs that it's on PIAA's radar and it's something that we hopefully would be moving forward towards sponsorship.
And the idea kind of is to answer that question in some way, to give some clarity on where you believe this might go, which might make an administrator or a school board's decision a little bit easier if they are considering something like this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I hope it greases the wheels a little bit, shows that PIAA has not only embraced the sport or recognized the sport with this emerging sport status, but also we've identified a one-stop shop, the group that is ultimately spearheading this. And in the case of girls wrestling, that's obviously Sanction PA. They have been at the forefront of this since the inception of the push to have girls wrestling adopted. And we think it's important to make sure that our member school administrators have a direct line of communication to the people that are making this go statewide.
Can you speak a bit to the idea of sustainability of if or when the PIAA clears? I mean, we're talking about girls wrestling. I think this can apply to other championship events as well.
Yep.
But the importance of knowing how sustainable it's going to be before you it's not a 1-year commitment. It's essentially for you guys a forever commitment to make sure that it's on the right track to being there in the long haul too.
Yeah, I shared with you previously that I was fortunate enough to give a presentation at our national meeting, knowing that PIAA is moving in this direction with emerging sports status. That since 1974, there's really only been one sport on either side, both boys and girls, that have been dropped from championship status, and that was gymnastics. And we've seen a large number of schools. First was boys gymnastics was dropped as a championship sport and ultimately a sport under jurisdiction. But girls gymnastics now has a little over 20 schools actively participating. And our policy that's been adopted by the board is at least 100 schools need to be sponsoring a sport before the board gives consideration to a championship. So we have a common goal, and I know Sanction PA shares that goal, that we do want sustainability, that when we look to sponsor a championship, we do want it to be forever. And it's not something that can just be hit or miss moving forward. And we also want to make sure that the championship that we sponsor is viable and representative of our membership.
How do you reconcile the desire to obviously be thoughtful and to be thinking about the big picture in the long term with this notion out there that 30 plus other states have done this already? Pennsylvania is so strong in the sport of wrestling. Why is Pennsylvania on the back end of this as opposed to the front end of this?
Yeah, I would say that's what brings about the most emotion with discussion of girls wrestling is the strength of our state. And we're proud of the strength of wrestling in our state. All of us are a little different as state associations. We all appear to be about the same, but I would say we're best described as snowflakes. That you put us under a microscope, we all operate a little bit differently than one another in one fashion or another. And this may be the case. You know, there's been over the last 10 years a desire to ensure that we sponsor competition by gender. And by that, you'll recall a time when many boys were participating in either girls volleyball or field hockey. And we were fortunate enough back in 2014 to have a change in a long injunction against the association that previously prevented us from enacting any rules that prohibited girls from playing on boys teams or boys from playing on girls teams. And so based on that approach with the Attorney General's office, also based on the approach that we took with the schools that helped us with having that injunction modified, we still think it is important to recognize competition by gender and make sure that the girls wrestling is sustainable. We don't want to just see the growth of the sport done by what happened back in 1974 and many schools looking to accommodate those interests just by having them participate on the boys team. We think it's important to have girls wrestling against girls, and the more competitions that can take place in that fashion, I think will help with the growth of the sport. And I know Sanction PA is working to that effect to try to bring about the largest number of competition of girls participation only.
And speaking of Sanction PA, how would you classify the working relationship on all sides with them and the National Wrestling Coaches Association? Kind of fortunate to have the NWCA kind of right down the road. But I think, many people might want to paint this picture of it being an adversarial relationship. One of the enlightening things was just how cooperatively everybody's just having discussions and keeping each other in the know about what the next steps are.
Yeah, we are definitely fortunate to have NWCA in our backyard. Pat Tossi is who I work primarily there. He's also with Sanction PA. Brooke Zumas, the coach at Parkland, also spearheads Sanction PA, and they're fantastic people. They're not only good wrestling people, they're just good people. And as an example of that working relationship, as soon as this emerging sports status document was adopted on the first reading, that next day, I distributed it out to those folks, and we hopped on the call to discuss the different merits. And with the idea that if they have ideas on how this can improve and help them moving forward, we want them to share that. And I know we'll get together coming up here before the September meeting when the board hears it on a second reading to have that discussion so we can include any of those suggestions for the board's consideration.
With that in mind, with the emerging sports status in mind, how would you kind of quantify how likely it is that Pennsylvania girls wrestling can move forward without getting to the 100 school mark? Like, that's a big question that I have, is that 100 is a lot. They've worked pretty tirelessly and they're up to 13 now.
Yeah.
And I know that maybe with 13 on board, it can pick up some pace, but you do the math and it's still a long way off mathematically. I just wonder from your perspective, what needs to happen to not need 100 schools?
Well, I think for us to have a lesser number than that, we'll have to have the board give consideration to the policy regarding championships, because I think the expectation is that if PIAA assumes jurisdiction over the sport, a championship is following it. That there's not going to be this period of we adopt jurisdiction over the sport and then wait a number of years before we sponsor championships. So I think the intention, not to speak for them, but what I hear from boots on the ground is once this comes under the jurisdiction, the expectation is there's going to be a championship. So I know I'm being redundant, but that's important. Other states that we've looked at, because we have had this discussion, look at a percentage of their membership. When the 100 was adopted back in the early 2000s, a lot of that had to do with taking a look at the sports that were currently being sponsored at the championship level and making sure that we weren't adopting something that would potentially take a sport out of championship existence. And so it was well below any of those numbers. So it wasn't looked at as too high of a threshold. Using 10% of our membership, we have approximately 750 senior high schools. So that maybe 75 is a better number. I don't know what the magic in that is, but the idea is that a championship should still be reflective of the membership.
Yeah. Let me shift gears for a moment. I want to play the part of somebody who's passionate about girls wrestling. My school district does not have girls wrestling. What's the most productive thing that I can do to try to make sure that my voice counts and to try to make an impact in all this? Because I can assume it's not call Mark Byers and yell at Mark Byers. It's something other than that. That might be fun though.
They're certainly welcome to do so. They wouldn't be the first or last to do that. But I think anytime you work with a school, the best thing is to work with the athletic administration of the school. They're the folks that are in tune to the desires of what's going on within that school athletically. So athletic director, principal, and I would say, like all things, when we do get questions about school activities, if you're not happy with the results that you go there, then there's a chain of command within the school that ultimately the decision makers are the board of directors. No different than in my position here. I'm not a policy maker. I certainly have suggestions, but ultimately the board of directors is going to give us our marching orders. And I would say that's the process. But first, if not with the local coach, that being the wrestling coach, but then work with the athletic administration of the school.
And I just wonder, just along these lines, just when it comes to criticism, I mean, the PIAA, kind of like the NCAA, is such an easy, I mean, there's a bullseye all the time. And I kind of get it, but at what point in your PIAA career did you realize, like, okay, I got to thicken my skin up a little bit because this just comes with the territory? Resistance or criticism, fair or unfair, I think oftentimes unfair, but it comes with the territory that you've got to learn how to deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's any time that you're in a position that's a decision-making position, and whether that's eligibility, whether that's we keep score whenever students participate, there's going to be someone on the winning end and someone on the losing end. And oftentimes, unfortunately, individuals look to blame someone rather than themselves. I think it's one of the great things about wrestling. Having gone through it, there's not a whole lot of blame usually that can go around. You're either better than your opponent or you're not. And I think that's why wrestlers get sometimes, and Sanction PA is a good example of it. They get that, okay, we didn't get the answer we wanted. Now, how do we work to make this better? And they have the resolve, I think, in order to achieve what they ultimately desire.
Lastly, for you here, I think just to kind of follow along with what's moving forward, what are the key dates when it comes to board meetings, key times when this conversation will move forward because it's not that far off?
Yeah, we have a meeting coming up mid-September. We're attempting to be proactive and meet more often than we have in the past. We'll have 8 meetings, although hopefully not 18 like we had last year. But we are going to meet mid-September, again mid-October, and then you could see ultimate adoption of it since it's already passed on a first reading at that October meeting. So in time for the wrestling season, the timelines that are a part of it. That's something that I know both Brooke and Pat have asked, would the board give consideration to moving that up? We borrowed a lot of that emerging sports status, the language from the NCAA. We're good at stealing things. When there's good information out there, we're like any other group. You take it and run with it rather than reinventing the wheel. But those timelines, I think, will be a hindrance. It is certainly not an attempt to put this off. So I think we'll be able to advance some of the timelines. So moving forward, they could receive that status and indicate to the membership that this is a direction we want to go in.
There you go. That's Mark Byers, Chief Operating Officer of the PIAA, head of the PIAA's Wrestling Steering Committee, joining us here with some insights from your perspective. And I think people can appreciate that and put a face with a name. And as you mentioned before we started recording here, now they can see who to hate instead of just imagining Mark Byers.
Appreciate that.
You're welcome. You're welcome forever. But yeah, I appreciate your time and your attention on this, Mark. Thank you.
Hey, great speaking with you. Thanks for having me, Dustin.
Yeah, good speaking with you as always, Mark. And thanks for everybody else for tuning in. Be sure to check out everything we're doing as part of Girls Wrestling Week here on PennLive. You can do that by visiting PennLive.com/high school sports/wrestling. And we'll see you next time.